I am delighted to welcome you here this morning to discuss China's emerging role in international conflict resolution. In the last month, China has shifted from a hands-off approach to conflicts that are far from its own neighborhood to a developing role as a convener, mediator, or guarantor of a new deal to reestablish diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And Beijing has also floated the idea that it could use President Xi's trip to Moscow to broker a ceasefire or other end to hostilities between Russia and Ukraine, though, of course, in that case, there was no breakthrough. We have three excellent panelists to unpack these recent events and help us understand China's motivation for getting involved in these negotiations, its role or its potential role in conflict resolution, and the impact that China's role might have on global peace and stability through the outcomes of these deals. I'm going to introduce the panelists and invite each of them to give opening remarks, after which I'll moderate a short discussion, and then we'll turn to questions from our audience. Let me start with Ambassador Martin Indyk, who is the Lowy Distinguished Fellow on U.S. Middle East Relations at the Council on Foreign Relations. Ambassador Indyk served twice as U.S. Ambassador to Israel and was appointed in 2013 by President Barack Obama to serve as U.S. Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Outside of government, Ambassador Indyk has held several senior positions in the U.S. think tank community and authored several books on diplomacy in the Middle East. Ambassador, I'd like to turn to you to unpack this recent Saudi-Iran deal. Where did China have success in bringing the two parties to agreement, and how do you see China's role in this very complex web of relationships and shifting interests in the Middle East?
Well, thank you, Rorry and Danny. It's a pleasure to be here at the Asia Society. I kind of work just across the road there, but it's been a while, and I'm delighted to be back. You know, the role of China in the Persian or Arabian Gulf, depending on what you want to label it, let's just call it the Gulf, has been somewhat of a shock to people. That suddenly it wings in and mediates a conflict between the most influential Sunni power and the most influential Shia power that have been at loggerheads for decades. But the question in my mind is, what took them so long? That may seem a bit strange, but the reality is that the United States used to define our interests in the Middle East being Israel, oil, oil, and oil. China today defines its interests in the Middle East as almost entirely oil-related. It has a robust relationship with Israel too, but it doesn't have the commitment that the United States does. Whereas the United States no longer depends on Middle Eastern oil. We're the largest oil producer in the world. We're exporting oil. We do import about 5% of our imports from Saudi Arabia. But that's de minimis and not important. We can buy it anywhere else without any great difficulty. China, on the other hand, imports 18% of its total crude oil purchases from one country, from Saudi Arabia. And that's, you know, something like 1.8 million barrels of oil a day from Saudi Arabia. About, not exactly clear, but it's about 1 to 1.3 million barrels a day from Iran. And all of that oil comes through the Straits of Hormuz and then all the way through the Indian Ocean, through the Straits of Malacca, up through the South China Sea. And the United States, especially in the Gulf, controls those waters. We have for a long time provided security for the oil lines of communication between Saudi Arabia and China, and we do today. We have, in fact, our boot on China's throat, to put it crudely. And for a long time, the Chinese have been freeloading of our taxpayers' commitment to maintaining security in the Gulf. So what we have, in other words, is a major shift in the balance of interests when it comes to this particular part of the world, which holds so much of the world's oil reserves. Saudi Arabia alone has something like 18%, 17% of the world's oil reserves. But it's China that's dependent on that oil now, not the United States. And that was not true for the longest time, but it is very true today. And the consequence of that is that China has to look to how it can preserve its oil supplies from that area. And that region, as I'm sure you're all aware, is a turbulent one, a highly volatile one. We fought two very large and very expensive wars there over Iraq and ISIS. And the Chinese were, for the longest time, very happy to have a situation in which we were bogged down in the Middle East and therefore unable to pay attention to what China was doing, and where, as I said before, we were securing their oil supplies. So suddenly the world is turned on its head, but it's a situation in which, number one, we need to kind of adjust our own lens, the way that we view this. And we need to comprehend also what was in this for Saudi Arabia, our longtime ally in the Middle East, that essentially invited China to play the role of mediator between Saudi Arabia and its longtime enemy, Iran, and in effect invited to have this diplomatic role in the Gulf. Exactly what China did to achieve this agreement is unclear. Exactly what is in this agreement is unclear. It hasn't been published. There have been various briefings that suggest that it provides for not only the resumption of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also for Iran to use its influence on the Houthis in Yemen, who control Yemen for all intents and purposes, and have kept Saudi Arabia tied down in a war of Saudi Arabia's own making in Yemen for years now, causing a terrible humanitarian crisis in the process. And the Saudis should have never gone in the first place, have concluded that they need to get out. But the Houthis, supplied by Iran with all manner of weapons, but in particular with drones and rockets that they've been using to attack Saudi Arabian civilian targets and oil infrastructure. And as a consequence, the Saudis have a real interest in finding a way to get the Houthis to cut it out. If China persuaded Iran to cut the supply of its drones and rockets to the Houthis, and persuaded Iran to use its influence to get the Houthis to reconcile or make some kind of understanding with Saudi Arabia that would enable it to withdraw, then it would have done a great service, first and foremost, to the people of Yemen. And the ultimate irony is that it would also have done a service to the United States. Because, and I'll finish on this note, since the Biden administration came into office, its first priority has been to deal with the geopolitical challenges from Russia in Europe, most obviously with its aggressive war in Ukraine, and with China's assertiveness in Asia. The pivot from the Middle East was supposed to have taken place under the Obama administration. It was certainly given a boost by the Trump administration. But from the point of view of the Biden administration, that was the priority elsewhere than the Middle East. And the Middle East was downgraded in importance. The objective that the Biden administration has set and clung to is to calm things down. It's a kind of prosaic objective, but that's basically it. Calm things down. Try to prevent the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from exploding. Try to mediate the conflict in Libya. A big effort to try to mediate the conflict in Yemen between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. And to try to find a way to contain Iran and curb its march towards a nuclear threshold. It's all about calming things down. Now, if China comes in, using its influence in Iran, and we do not have that kind of influence, we don't even we don't have diplomatic relations with Iran, and our negotiations with them are paralyzed at this point. If China comes in and manages to use its influence with Iran to help to settle the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, it's to the Biden administration's interest in terms of calming things down. And it's a win-win, because if China didn't really succeed in getting Iran to do this, which I suspect is the case, and we soon discover that the Iranians are playing a game and have no intentions of using their influence with the Houthis to give up a card there, then the monkey will be on China's back. China will have the responsibility for trying to deliver this very difficult partner of it in this deal. So either way, the United States wins. And I think that we should kind of adjust our lens to consider this as an area where we could actually cooperate with China rather than necessarily compete with it.
Thank you very much for that excellent summary of China's role in what's happening in the Middle East and how the U.S. should react. I love the idea that there might be an alignment of interest here for China. It's the energy dependence and the need to create stability in the Middle East. For the U.S., it's the focus of attention on other areas of the world and therefore the need to calm things down. I want to turn now to Ambassador Thomas Pickering, who is joining us by phone. Ambassador Pickering is currently the Vice President of Hills and Company, but he's served for more than 4 decades as a U.S. diplomat, including as ambassador to the United Nations, the Russian Federation, India, Israel, and Jordan, among other ambassadorships, as well as serving as Undersecretary of Political Affairs at the U.S. State Department, among many other positions. So, Ambassador Pickering, thanks for joining us via phone today. I'd love to turn to you to walk us through China's interests and equities in ending the war in Ukraine and whether or not you think China could play a role in conflict resolution in Eastern Europe.
Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me. It's a pleasure to join you, and particularly to follow my old friend Martin, whose presentation I thought was first-rate and whose conclusion tilts in the direction in which I think my conclusion could be tilted over a period of time and with some extra work. I no longer am associated with Hills, which has been morphed into Albright Stonebridge, just for the record. And my talk this morning will hopefully be brief, but will cover some of the background of Russia-China, as well as some of the war status, which is affecting the participation of China. a little bit of a harder look at China's proposals, which have tended to get mired in the pretty vehement anti-U.S. China posture, which is unfortunately a hallmark of U.S. attitudes toward both enemies and potential enemies, which allows little room for negotiation and contact, which I think is a serious mistake. And then I want to have a few concluding remarks. For background, obviously, Russia and China have both differences and cooperative endeavors. They began the Russian attack against Ukraine with the week before an alliance without limits. That in itself signaled to all of us, one, a pretty clear intention on Putin's part of moving militarily. Secondly, a pretty clear sense that President Xi had drunk a little too much of the Kool-Aid, that it will be over in 3 days, 3 weeks, or 3 months, but not longer than that, with Russia in full control both of Ukraine and perhaps Moldova. It ended with support for Russia in the Security Council, which continues, and it is also, I think, also ended with the beginnings of Chinese support for limited weapons to Russia. We don't know exactly how much or how high up the scale of technology that may go, but it is a posture. So I would characterize that piece of the posture on the pro-Russian side. The overall China-Russia posture has been over many years afflicted by some serious differences. Beginning under communism and Stalin's day, the really interesting question of who leads, China or Russia, the alliance, whether it is based on communism or post-communist autocracy as a unifying force. Secondly, that is also reflected on the potential, and I say only potential now, for differences reemerging on the China-Russia border. I don't anticipate it because I think much of those differences in the 60s reflected political strains in their relationship rather than deeply held territorial differences, and mostly were focused on islands in the Amur River. Thirdly, there is obviously a sensitivity in Russia that is highly racial, that is very deeply suspicious of Chinese, particularly moving in to Siberia for the issues of trade, whether it is day trading, so to speak, or whether it is a more permanent relationship. And then there have been long-standing differences since the 16th century over areas of territory on the Pacific maritime coast where China had a degree of influence prior to Tsarist muscling them out, which still linger in the system of China's look at Russia. On the question of the balance there, my own sense is that beginning with the Russian invasion, it was almost completely Russia-China full cooperation. Since then, China has warned Russia, for example, against the use of nuclear weapons, and in some other ways, in favor of negotiations as an outcome, which indicate that the Chinese are riding the fence with one foot, if I could put it this way, in the Moscow camp, but another foot essentially in can we find an early end to this messy conflict. The war, as we have seen now, is in a stalemate with each side promising a coming offensive with uncertainty about when. Our support for Ukraine is translated into an early expectation of Ukraine launching an offensive, particularly with the receipt of more heavy armor, air defense, and similar weapons, perhaps up to and including a significant additional supply of Soviet-type aircraft from the Polish stockpiles. We'll wait and see on that. The objectives of both sides in the military conflict remain directly different and directly opposite. Ukraine to recover all of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. Russia to taking all of Ukraine, and as I hinted earlier, under the best of circumstances, which so far has widely eluded Russian objectives, perhaps even Moldova. And both sides seem at the moment to be in a 3-no posture. No negotiations, unfortunately for them, no early victory, and certainly no closure, if I could put it that way, in a process of any kind. This obviously means China, in the end, is looking toward a world pattern of behavior as a leading multilateral state, not in any sense at all as a vassal prisoner of Russian objectives, but quite the opposite. And that Putin is certainly fending off, if I could put it this way, anything that looks as if he has collapsed under China leadership, but has not contested in whatever ways we see coming out of the 2 meetings he's had with President Xi in a situation in which he has resiled from what he would call an equal seat at the Russia-China table. Let me then go to the Chinese moves to foster, as they did with Iran and Saudi Arabia, a mediating or facilitating role, and their proposals for how and in what way this should come about, with some comments on the proposals, which I think, perhaps unfortunately for the present situation, did not get a great deal of diplomatic examination, but were in one way or another written off rather rapidly. Jake Sullivan's initial response at the NSC was, in effect, the first element of those proposals: respect for sovereignty, territorial contiguity, and independence, was, I think, his point that the proposals needed to go no further than that. The president at one time seemed to have been a little more friendly to the proposals. That has seemingly gone away. The second Chinese proposal was to abandon the Cold War mentality, no security at the expense of others, and a situation which they treated security as too complex to be easily rectified, even at the negotiating table, but nevertheless should be looked at. The third was the cessation of hostilities, which both sides now seemingly reject, but the Chinese made it clear that their support for a cessation of hostilities was to assure that no one really benefits from the current war, and therefore it is time to end the killing and the wounding and the destruction and move to something else. Something else was their fourth point, to resume peace talks, which had begun and were being pursued sporadically, but died away with the Russian withdrawal from Kyiv and Kharkiv and the Ukrainian successful offensive for the early autumn. The fifth Chinese proposal was to resolve the humanitarian crisis, something that I think makes sense in a broad and humanitarian way, obviously, on the basis, as the Chinese phrased it, neutrality and impartiality. The Chinese sixth point was to protect civilians and prisoners of war, something that reflects pretty much a general orientation of the international community toward the crisis, and the succeeding points move into what has been called confidence-building aspects of the current problem with respect to a number of issues. One was POW exchanges. Another was to keep nuclear power plants safe. That was the seventh. The eighth was to reduce strategic risks. No nuclear weapons to be used, no nuclear wars to be fought. The ninth point was to facilitate grain exports, continuation of the quadripartite deal to support Ukrainian exports, but presumably also Russia grain exports and Russia's interest in fertilizer exports, something that has just received, as far as I can tell, a 60-day extension. 10th was to stop unilateral sanctions, something the U.S. is very much attached to. The Chinese feeling was that pressure won't stop the conflict and it just causes damage to civilian populations. The 11th was to keep open industrial and other supply chains in the world economy. And the 12th was to promote reconstruction for the post-conflict period. Each of these, in one way or another, in my own view, has potential positive and useful actions, as well as deleterious and unsuitable approaches. But for any international conflict in which people are seeking some kind of resolution, China has taken the advantage of producing something under which ambiguity seems to work from their perspective in favor of trying to garner a wider degree of support. So far, they haven't received it. So far, the Chinese 12 proposals do not in any serious way match with the Zelensky 10 proposals, a serious difference there, and where a number of Russian thoughts and ideas, as they have been expressed over time, do not match with China's. A few final thoughts. The war goes on. So far, very little impact on the parties, either by China or anyone else. But if you were to ask, I think, significant observers of the scene about which countries might have the most positive effect on ending the conflict in the relatively near term, given the fact that very little interest on the parties exists for that period of time, I think you would have had to include the U.S., China, and perhaps in its own way, India. And one wonders whether some kind of further cooperation is possible between them, and whether China, in what we see potentially as a balance or tilt away from pure support of the Russian position to something more balanced, would be open to discussions that might be pursued as a way of beginning both to modify and bring forward points and issues, if not immediately useful for a solution, at least useful in the preparations for a solution. And the final point I make is the U.S. still in its own approach, prepared to look at how and in what way some areas of cooperation with China can be maintained and perhaps pursued, even in the face of the growing universal deep sense of difference and, for many, the inevitability of war. Derek Chollet, the counselor of the department, is reported to have made a statement in a recent trip to Southeast Asia that the State Department favors keeping open the door to elements of cooperation, which has been encouraging, and hopefully that can be something that the U.S. can play a facilitative role in this process. But that remains open, highly controversial, and at the moment partly wrapped up in the notion that if the U.S. is to play its traditional role as essentially the go-to power in the world, there is little or no room for China in the same area working in the same direction. Are we prepared to seek ways to make that more amenable to U.S. interests, or are we stuck basically in an inevitable posture of opposition? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Pickering. Your comments were incredibly insightful on both the developing situation in Eastern Europe, China's proposals for conflict resolution, which I think I could briefly summarize as two kind of baskets. One is an alignment on principles of how states should conduct behavior, and another set on minimizing the impacts of the conflict. But also on, how the U.S. should react and whether the U.S. can make space for China to play a more active role at times where interests align. On that last point, I'd like to turn to my colleague here at the Asia Society Policy Institute, Danny Russel, who is our Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy, and comes to us as a retired, perhaps recovering U.S. diplomat, serving most recently as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific in President Obama's second term. Danny's been with the Policy Institute since 2017 and spearheads our work on regional security issues, including several projects on China's expanding interest and influence through the Belt and Road Initiative and through other Chinese proposals and global policies. So, Danny, we've heard a little bit about the specifics of the shifting alignments in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, but the open question, which Ambassador Pickering left us with, is how will the U.S. react to an increased role for China in international mediation efforts? Can you help us better understand how China's growing global interests are changing its position on international mediation? Why is China investing in these processes? What does it have to gain? And how does this play out against the backdrop of U.S.-China strategic competition and a very strained U.S.-China relationship in general?
Well, thank you, Rory. Those are great and important questions. I have been a recovering diplomat for years, recovering from working alongside Ambassador Indyk and working for Ambassador Tom Pickering. I just had a relapse, however. And I'll tell you that following Martin and Tom is truly an exercise in humility. In fact, listening to Tom reminds me of the first time that I worked for him when he was the U.S. permanent representative to the UN, and those were the very early days of the Perm 5, and maybe the beginning of the emergence of China as a diplomatic actor. The two issues I recall where we were very deeply involved with the Chinese at the time, quite apart from the Gulf War, before that the Iran-Iraq War, was the Cambodian peace talks and North Korea, and specifically the entry of North and South Korea to the UN. And I'd say that by and large, in both cases, China's diplomacy was, such as it was very self-interested, very narrowly focused on protecting its interests, protecting its clients. And so a lot has changed since then, and as you allude to, there's been a real shift, but I think these are still attributes that we can see in China's approach to diplomacy, to mediation. Anyway, so much for memory lane. Let me make some general comments sort of to frame. First and foremost, it would be a terrible mistake to overlook the fact that China fields immensely competent and talented diplomats. It's not just a cohort of wolf warriors. These people are good and know what they're doing. Secondly, that the PRC has put a tremendous amount of importance on expanding its presence, its personnel, its influence in international organizations and specialized agencies in the UN and peacekeeping and the various subsidiary organizations in the UN solar system, technical agencies, as well as regional or smaller groupings, SICA, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on. So it's not a stranger to multilateralism, and it's not a stranger to kind of the adjudication that goes on in multilateral institutions. My experience with Chinese diplomacy is that, as a general matter, and certainly as connects with mediation, that the Chinese approach focuses very heavily on the power holders in the relevant countries and not in the stakeholders more broadly. And that ties into another aspect, which is that Chinese diplomacy is what I would consider value neutral or even amoral, in the sense that it's not bound up with these moral precepts like human rights, like democracy, like protection of civil society, good governance, political rights, and so on. And the effect of that is to kind of exempt China and Chinese diplomacy from the baggage of moralism and the linkage, the perpetual linkage to human rights and so on, things that are generally resented by dictators all around the world. And so whether it's Bashir, right, or any of other, Assad, or the Ayatollah, or any of other of Martin's friends, or whether it's Kim Jong-un, whether it's the Taliban, I think China's comfort with dictators has been something of an asset to it in diplomacy. As Martin pointed out, the Chinese have no problem talking to the Iranians or to the Saudis or anybody else. I think, generally speaking, Beijing has been most comfortable, at least traditionally, as part of the pack in a sort of broader multinational diplomatic effort, or as a largely hands-off host to talks involving multiple parties. So examples are, for example, with North Korea and the six-party talks, where China provided the venue, the Daoyutai banquets, Great Hall of the People, receptions, and so on. But there, too, alluding to Martin's point about the U.S. strategy in the Middle East, it was very much about calming things down. It was about lowering risk. It wasn't really about solving the problems or getting at the underlying issues. And I think we've seen China, I've certainly seen China as being very timid about actually using its leverage. We can talk more about North Korea if you want. I think JCPOA is another example of sort of China safe in the middle of the pack. South Sudan, Afghanistan, there are more examples of that. And I think, obviously, that lets China claim some credit when, at least for being a responsible global actor and making the effort. It gives it a ringside seat and allows it to protect its interests or protect the interests of its clients. It can take credit for anything that goes well. It can sidestep responsibility when things don't go so well. And I think Martin's point about whether or not the Chinese can in fact deliver the Iranians if things don't go smoothly is very relevant and very interesting. Look, it's pretty obvious that China's international exposure in these far-flung regions beyond China's near abroad, beyond its periphery, and the presence of Chinese around the world, these things have spiked along with China's explosive economic growth and commercial interests. Its natural resource demands certainly have grown, as you pointed out, Martin. And so have its overseas markets, and so have its security interests well beyond its borders. Since 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has been a huge driver of China's overseas presence and overseas investment. It's given it expat workers and huge economic interests to protect, something that it didn't previously have. And it's forced Beijing, I think, to be less passive about safeguarding its own interests and become more active in actual conflict prevention or conflict management. In the last few years, during Xi Jinping's second term, we've begun to see a number of other changes. For one thing, China is fielding a huge, not huge, but a significant cohort of special envoys. Special envoy for the Middle East, for African affairs writ large, for the Horn of Africa specifically, for the Pacific Island nations, for Afghan affairs, and so on. This is new. I think that we've also seen, as a practical matter, a sort of departure, maybe a hollowing out of China's much vaunted principle of non-interference. And where Chinese interests require it, they haven't been shy about, frankly, interfering and engaging. It's reasonable to expect that as China gains more confidence in its mediation abilities, that China's approach to various problems that impinge on its own interests can become much more assertive, much more aggressive. And we may see a willingness by China to actually use its leverage, its economic, diplomatic, even military leverage to shape outcomes. We haven't seen it yet. To your specific question, I think that one level, as Tom pointed out, the logic drives the United States strategy in the direction of coordinating with China. But by the same token, the logic of a global pandemic should have driven the United States to coordinate and, if not cooperate, with China. An alien invasion should drive the United States to want to cooperate with China, but I'm not at all confident that any of those sort of cataclysmic pressures would succeed in an environment that, as Tom pointed out, is so rabid, both in terms of the political class's attitude in the United States towards China and vice versa. Tom ran through the 12 principles, and I think the Chinese were careful to characterize them as principles, although there's been some sloppy talk about it being a peace proposal. And these are built on the 5 principles that the Chinese announced shortly after Putin's invasion, and they came right on the first-year anniversary, so there's some kind of anniversary quality to it. The problem that the Biden administration has, quite apart from the atmosphere within the Beltway when it comes to China, is that it's very difficult to take at face value China's claims to be committed to the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity when Xi Jinping's friend and partner without limits, Vladimir Putin, ran utterly roughshod over the sovereignty and the territory of a UN member state without even an alibi. And as you go down the list, the concept of absolute security being the enemy, the accusation that's leveled against the United States, namely that the U.S. insists on striving for perfect security at the expense of everyone else's interests, is a pretty accurate characterization of Putin's argument that he has a right to invade Ukraine because NATO has been looking at him cross-eyed. So when you run down the list of these principles, as often happens with Chinese initiatives, they sound awfully good, but they are low on real credibility. All that said, I think the logic is unassailable that only with the active involvement of the U.S. could Zelensky and the Ukrainians believe that a negotiating framework might be fair, and only with Xi Jinping's help could Putin perhaps have the same view. I'll admit that only Tom could come up with the third magic ingredient of India, which had absolutely never occurred to me. I've been thinking about the EU, which will clearly pull the equation too far in the direction of the West for Putin to swallow. It's an intriguing idea. Let me stop there.
Okay, thank you, Danny. Appreciate your characterization of China as, putting forward a lot of interesting and potentially useful ideas, but also exempting itself selectively from some of the rules and principles that would make those deals worthwhile, as well as, China's relative comfort with negotiating, with like-minded systems that do not take into account some of the traditional Western values of, human rights, freedom of speech, et cetera.
Universal values.
Universal Western values. So I'd like to have a round of questions here between our panelists, and then I'll open it up for the audience. Please start getting your questions ready. Mics will be passed around, so please do wait until you get the mic so that everyone can hear you. But in the meantime, I'd like to turn back to Ambassador Indyk. So you had hinted in your opening remarks that China is going to potentially face a lot of difficulties in guaranteeing the type of deal that we assume has taken place. I think there's a little bit, as you mentioned, some opacity on what the terms of this deal are. There's also opacity on China's role in this entire process. I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit on what you see as the likely difficulties China will face, China's likely reaction to those difficulties, and maybe a bit more broadly on the role of opacity in diplomatic negotiations. Can it be a benefit to not have all of the terms of the deal out for everyone to scrutinize and examine? Does that flexibility give some running room for managing some of the difficulties that will come up?
Yeah, just to answer the last question first, definitely opacity has some advantages, as does ambiguity, and there's a good deal of both in this agreement. But eventually it will become clear whether the Chinese have effected a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or whether it's just papering over of what is a centuries-old conflict between the Saudis and the Iranians, between the Sunnis and the Shias. And that conflict has raged in the last few decades, basically since 1978, and has really deeply affected in a negative way the fate of countries in the Middle East and beyond, including all the way to Southeast Asia. And in the Middle East in particular, Iran has taken advantage of the fissures in Arab societies across the Middle East to build its influence with Shia populations. In some places, Shias are a majority, like Iraq and Bahrain. In other places, they are a significant minority or have a plurality, like in Lebanon. And you see it across the Middle East, that Iran has been able to build its influence and advance its hegemonic ambitions that it makes little effort to hide, from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq to Yemen. And that just happens to surround Saudi Arabia geographically. And the Saudis have not been at all timid in responding to that by supporting Sunni efforts to counter the Iranians. And the sectarian warfare that has taken place by proxies, in particular in the Middle East, has been really damaging. Now, the idea that China, whose influence with these two countries is limited, partly because they're dependent on these countries for their oil supplies, could swan in and resolve this deep, centuries-old conflict and competition is, in my view, far-fetched. In my view, it's simply a papering over of their differences that has been facilitated by China because both Iran and Saudi Arabia wanted to bring China in for their own reasons. China for Iran is a way of escaping the sanctions that the United States has been imposing on Iran. And China, in effect, broke the embargo on Iranian oil sales. Was it a year ago, 2 years ago? And that's really important to Iran. So Iran has an interest in helping China play the role that obviously it would like to play. Saudi Arabia similarly, and it's not just because Saudi Arabia is the largest trading partner, and as China depends on Saudi oil, Saudi Arabia depends on the Chinese oil market. So there's a mutual interest there. But beyond that, from Saudi Arabia's perspective, the United States has become unreliable as its ally and protector of its security. And from our perspective, Saudi Arabia has become irresponsible under its leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. But there's a real tension in the relationship, and I'm happy to go into it if you want, but that tension in the relationship has led the Saudis to seek to balance their relations with the United States, both with Russia and with China. Now, Russia doesn't look like such a good bet for balancing at the moment, given that it's losing the war in Ukraine, or maybe has already lost it. But China does look like a good bet from the Saudi point of view, to balance its dependence on the United States for its security, and I think to also try to encourage the United States to play a more active role in Saudi Arabia's security. It's actually at the same time as it is inviting China into the Gulf in a political, diplomatic way, it is asking the United States for a security guarantee, an Article 5 type guarantee. I mean, good luck with that. But that's what they're doing at the same time, imagining somehow that they are so important that they can play us off against each other. And so I think that's part of what you're seeing here, is the Saudis and the Iranians have a momentary common interest in looking to China to reduce the conflicts that they're facing, number one, because Saudi Arabia wants out of Yemen and Iran can help there. And Iran is under heavy pressure. Its economy is in trouble. It's facing significant internal dissent. And it wants to relieve that pressure. And reconciling with Saudi Arabia for the time being, reducing the tension there, serves Iranian interests as well. So there's a community of interests that has come together in doing this deal.
Thank you for that. You brought up a couple of topics that I want to pivot to Ambassador Pickering to discuss. One is the idea that that Iran and Saudi Arabia were very willing partners in this round of conflict resolution or mediation, whereas I think from Ambassador Pickering's remarks earlier, we learned that Russia and Ukraine are not willing partners to sit down at the table and negotiate right now. They're negotiating, via the battlefield, not via peace talks. But another point you brought up that I think would be interesting to examine in the Russia context is the role and effect of sanctions on making partners more or less willing to negotiate, and particularly to accept China as a mediator or a guarantor. So, Ambassador Pickering, I'd like to invite you to comment on those set of topics. Where do you think international sanctions, and particularly U.S. sanctions that have hit the Iranian economy quite hard, that are definitely hitting the Russian economy hard, how do you think those play into partner willingness to sit down and talk? And how does China's role fit into the U.S.-led pressure campaigns against Russia and Iran?
Thank you very much. And I'd like to, if I can, springboard off Martin's very interesting and useful presentation with a single idea, which then I'll apply to sanctions. The idea is something that we have all been aware of for a long time, but I like to call the hegemon trap. And the hegemon trap is wherever we find difficulty in dealing with a foreign country, we somehow create the view that that country, whether it was the Soviet Union, now the Chinese, perhaps ourselves, since we have said so very clearly, are interested in becoming the player, the hegemon in the world. And that colors our thinking in ways that I think build extremist approaches where, in fact, we need more moderate approaches. The best example of calling it well is George Kennan in the Long Telegram, in which he told us, be patient, do what you can necessarily to keep things from getting worse, but understand that there will be a natural evolution of affairs in which over a period of time, the problem will be how do you deal with post-communism, not how do you deal with communist pretensions to run the world. And I think that that's important. Secondly, that plays a role in sanctions. And my own view is sanctions is a crude weapon, just the way the use of force is a crude weapon. That sanctions has what I would call the capacity to create within its application as much disadvantage as advantage. And over a period of time, we have tried to refine our approach to sanctions against alienating a large share of the population of a foreign country by doing them personal harm in order to influence the outcome of political decisions in that country, often a dictatorship where the security system is strong enough to resist that kind of application, and where we have gone to targeted sanctions. And targeted sanctions, in my view, do not play a significant role in influencing the outcome of leaders whose travel is restricted as much as we may believe it. But it does have a very significant role to play in how and in what way we can affect their economic good health. That in itself is also a backdoor shot at the population. Foundering economics do not make what I would call the general public happy. And we have constantly look at it. In the U.S., it has taken on another approach. The Congress deeply wishes to run the world. And the Congress believes, because of its elected status, and there's nothing wrong with this, that it has a God-appointed mission of doing so. It has, however, a constitutional limitation, which in fact is you can do what you expect to do by majority vote as long as the president goes along with it. And that has led the Congress consistently and in some ways interminably to successive sanctions, often ginned up with the executive branch as a way of dealing with problems. And the good news is it's short of the use of force. And the bad news is it has pros and cons. And we are not yet capable of adjusting it in a way that makes the pros so much better than the cons. And we then create islands of antagonism and unhappiness and dyspepsia and indeed forceful opposition in places where it only works to our disadvantage in terms of how and in what way a body politic in a foreign country can have a deleterious relationship with its opposition in the United States. It's something we need to guard against. So not totally against sanctions, believe they have limited application in difficult circumstances, and I would say Russia, where I have lived, is a perfect example of a population that has a centuries-long tradition of resisting the imposition of foreign rule, foreign ideas, foreign morality, foreign governance in favor of its own national aspirations, and something that Putin has learned how to play like a Stradivarius.
Thank you, Ambassador Pickering. Really appreciate your views on sanctions in general. It strikes me that you've identified a lot of the potential advantages of sanctions, also some of the problems, chief among which I think is adaptation, particularly as China becomes a trading partner to more countries in the world, and as a multipolar world order emerges. Sanctions are less effective because countries can adapt, and they often do not create their intended effect of changing political calculations. Perhaps an extreme example of this is North Korea, where we have a country that is completely overtaken by a cult of personality and a dictatorial leadership, a country that sits on China's immediate border, separates China from U.S. allies and partners in South Korea and Japan, and is also, constantly kicking up a political and diplomatic storm over its nuclear program. So in the case of Russia, China's been quite far forward in reminding Russia and the world that it opposes nuclear weapons in all situations to resolve conflicts peacefully. And it seems to be using, in limited ways, its leverage with Russia, its economic leverage with Iran, Saudi Arabia, to create situations where nuclear armed, or at least almost nuclear capable powers no longer have the excuse, the opportunity to use them. With North Korea, China has almost unlimited leverage, we believe, and yet has used very little of it, perhaps none of it, to affect North Korea's nuclear development. Danny, how do you think China's interests in mediation on the Korean Peninsula differ from some of these other situations? And what can we expect if China becomes more of an international convener, mediator? How can we expect them to deal with the Korean Peninsula as that conflict gets hotter over time?
Great question. Yeah. Clearly, although China dreads the growth of North Korea's nuclear program and opposed the acquisition of nuclear weapons at all by North Korea, because North Korea borders China, because it borders an underdeveloped region that the central government in China is concerned about, because the Chinese nightmare is the United States co-opting the entirety of the Korean Peninsula and presenting a dagger to the soft underbelly of China and so on. Accepting the unfortunate reality of a nuclear North Korea is simply the price that I think China decided that it has no alternative but to swallow. I mean, interestingly, I think sanctions against North Korea are arguably an exception to the rule, and for the reason that the sanctions aren't really aimed at modifying North Korea's behavior, to the extent that they are, for the reasons that Tom pointed out. It's kind of a moot effort. What they are aimed at is degrading North Korea's ability to fuel its nuclear and military growth, depriving it of nutrients and creating barriers to its expansion, even though it's expanding, and certainly denying North Korea the kind of fruits of the crime, the benefits of the international system while it's in defiance. Whether we're talking about the Middle East, whether we're talking about Ukraine, Russia, or North Korea, or for that matter, Taiwan, while it's not a one-to-one correlation, there is a correlation between the antipathy in the U.S.-China relationship itself and the prospects for a constructive Chinese role. North Korea is an airbag that can absorb the threat and the impact of U.S. pressure from China. And if the price of having that buffer is that North Korea has nuclear weapons, which, by the way, keeps the U.S. military focused on North Korea rather than on China. And I know many people in China who have made it clear to me that they believe that all of the American resources that are now dedicated to watching or undermining North Korea would instantly shift to China were we to be freed from that burden. That calculus, the need to protect against the United States, is overwhelming.
Thank you, Danny. I'm going to take 3 questions from the audience all together, and then we will have our panelists wrap up. Please forgive me for being so engaged with our panelists' comments that we're running a little bit over time. But if we can have the microphone up here, please. We've got 2 questions in the front, and I can take an additional one if anybody has a hand raised. Okay, great. We have 3 questions in the front here. We'll take them all at once and then give each panelist a chance to respond.
Martin, you mentioned that the Chinese mediation involving Iran and Saudi Arabia may be nothing at the end but paper. And then we moved over to Ukraine. In the role of China's mediation efforts, is there something that where nothing becomes of either situation, both in the Ukraine on the 12-point proposal or in Yemen with respect to those results, that somehow China can look upon that it satisfied some win in its box, where it can walk away and say, yeah, we went in there, we knew this wasn't really going to work because of Russia's position, Zelensky's position, because of the two really are at odds. They've been at odds for years, but still, we got something out of it. What that is, maybe you can fathom, and claim that it is, in fact, a win for China. And China can go ahead and proceed and say, there was no loss to us, despite the fact that, people say it was a failure because, quote, there were no results.
Thank you. Lulu?
Thank you. Even this is an example that there are many different things that could be done to advance some accommodation between U.S. and China, and many good ideas came up during Ambassador Indyk's comments and Danny's as well, and Ambassador Pickering. But referring back to Ambassador Pickering's last comment, that we also have to be aware that there's a domestic audience that Biden is clearly have to be very aware of, and she does too. She also needs to play to the sentiment on the street. So given these other constraints, beyond the geopolitical issues that we're talking about, what are some ways that we can see an opportunity for these dissident interests to come together on shared interests where the public may be more supportive rather than opposed to accommodations?
Thank you. Last question here.
Yeah, I like to ask a question regarding the petrodollar. Given that a petrodollar is a huge part of, plays a significant role in Middle East in oil business, and in light of recent announcement that Saudi Arabia is going to export oil to China in Chinese currency, and also last week Brazil and China made an announcement that their future trades will be conducted in their own currencies. So my question to you is, do you see the recent event as the first of accelerated shift away from petrodollar? Thank you.
Thank you. Those are three excellent questions. I'm going to direct them just because we have so little time. So, Ambassador Indyk, I'd like to start with you on the petrodollar. What are the implications of trading in RMB as opposed to U.S. currency? Then, Danny, I'd love to turn to you on domestic audience and expectations in the U.S. and China. Is there an opportunity for an alignment between the two publics that moves some of these conflicts along? And finally, Ambassador Pickering, love to wrap up with you on the first question, if you can. Is there a win for China in no resolution, or is the Chinese interest, potentially more transactional than transformational? So please feel free to comment on other questions, but let's keep our comments to 2 minutes. And Ambassador Indyk, we'll start with you on petrodollar.
Yeah, well, to the extent that they follow through on these announcements that they're going to trade in their own currency or in the renminbi rather than in the dollar for their oil, it will have a marginal impact on the dollar as a reserve currency. Chinese obviously would benefit from the extent to which they could reduce the role of the US dollar in that regard, but I think they've got a long way to go. I don't see it as a threat at the moment, just because of this oil trade. If that's all it is, it's not going to really make a significant difference. But I just want to, since this is our concluding remarks, just say a word about the potential here, whether the publics will embrace it or not. The idea that China has an interest in stability in the Gulf, which is our primary interest now in the Gulf, is something that we should recognize, and recognize that it's not a zero-sum game. Saudi Arabia just announced that it was cutting oil production by 500,000 barrels to keep the price of oil up. That's not in our interests. By the way, it's not in China's interest either, as a major importer of oil. Amazingly, in this particular area, we have, I think, more in common with China than we do to compete with it. And so I think that we should just recognize it that way, instead of trying to keep score and saying, well, China really produced a big win here. We should see that it's actually serving American interests in the process.
Danny?
Well, Lily, you raised an incredibly important point, and you're right to point out that there are politics in China just like there are politics in the United States. I think that the way that the U.S. administration could and should approach this is, in order to bring the public along, to make a virtue of necessity and saying, we are getting China to carry its weight. We are getting China to do its part in maintaining stability in the Gulf, which is in China's interest. Getting China to do its part in stopping the fighting and working towards a resolution in Ukraine, which is in the world's interest. No use of nuclear weapons. That's one of the 12 principles. No threat to civilian nuclear installations. Protect civilians. Provide humanitarian relief. Keep the grain flowing to stave off famine around the world. We're getting China to do what it ought to be doing. And as long as China is working towards these goals, of course we're going to work with it. Of course we're going to stand up. I think there really is an argument to make that could bring the public along.
But I think we have to avoid using the "we're getting China to do this." It plays well to our audience, not well to the Chinese public. So we have to find a more diplomatic way to express the same issue.
Yeah, for those of you who did not hear that important comment, our audience member reminded us that such a framework might not play very well in China, and that we have to, find ways to cooperate and get along among our general publics. Ambassador Pickering, I'm going to turn to you for the final word before I close this out.
Yeah, I thought Danny answered beautifully the question you asked me to address, and I would just add to it the fact that China made a proposal. Whether that proposal is successful or not, it's a proposal toward an end to a very deleterious and very reckless and very dangerous conflict, which postulates the use of nuclear weapons. China's come out, as Danny remarked, and as I tried to illustrate in going over their points, in a direction that's close in a number of cases to what we favor and where we'll go. I think that that's significant. On the question of what is it that the U.S. and China could do together, just two examples. China's policy on the pandemic has been isolation and a weak vaccine. We have a very strong vaccine. There's no reason in my mind why we shouldn't cooperate with China in making a strong vaccine available to China. If they want to say they've invented it with or without our help, I don't really care. But my view is it's important because an epidemic in China has become an epidemic elsewhere around the world, and we're all in that pot together. And the notion that nationalist impulses should prevent us from helping save people's lives and health is not, in my view, on. The second question is climate change. There was no question at all that John Kerry was close to a real agreement with China on how we would cooperate in climate change. And it's very clear that China, particularly on renewables, has for a long while shown its concern about the deleterious effects of climate change on China, as well as the rest of the world. We have a natural potential area of close affinity there. Obviously, Taiwan has intervened in its own remarkable way, and that's something that we will not, I think, find easy. But I would strongly urge that the brilliance of the 1971 opening to China was a bridge to a one China policy. And that bridge to a one China policy should not be torn up and shredded and thrown away with all of the unfortunate outcomes that would produce. And so I would recommend those kinds of things for a closer looks inside the U.S. policy community.
Thank you. I am so pleased that we're ending on kind of a positive note here. I think we've agreed that there is a substantive alignment of interest between the U.S. and China in conflict resolution, also in these other global issues, whether it's food security, energy security, climate change, and pandemic preparedness and recovery. Before I invite you all to thank our panelists, please do consider coming back for more programs here at Asia Society. We have a fantastic exhibit downstairs in our museum entitled Comparative Hell, Arts of the Asian Underworld, perhaps a look at what happens when we don't have conflict resolution and mediation. And we also are going to run a number of policy programs in the coming months, not just on China, but on the region as a whole, including programs on the economy, programs on climate change, and other interesting areas for you all to consider. So please do visit our website at asiasociety.org. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn. We're now on Instagram if you prefer. But with all of that said, please join me in thanking our panelists today for an excellent discussion.